Marcus Blackwell's shadow fell across the hospital cafeteria like a storm cloud blocking the sun. At 62, the pharmaceutical magnate commanded fear wherever he walked, his steel-grey eyes cutting through crowds like surgical instruments. His perfectly tailored Italian suit couldn't hide the cold calculation that had built his empire on the backs of desperate patients who couldn't afford his life-saving medications. The hospital staff whispered as he passed. This was the man who had single-handedly driven up insulin prices by 400%, who had bought patents just to bury cheaper alternatives, who had turned human suffering into quarterly profits. Board meetings were legendary battlefields where grown executives trembled at his razor-sharp tongue and merciless business decisions. Today, he wasn't here for business. His own grandson lay upstairs, fighting leukemia with treatments that cost more than most people's homes. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same medications he priced beyond reach were now the only things standing between his family and devastating loss. But Marcus Blackwell had never been one for irony or sentiment. He paused at the cafeteria entrance, surveying the scene with the detached interest of a predator studying prey. Families huddled around plastic tables, their faces etched with the particular exhaustion that comes from watching loved ones suffer. Medical bills scattered like fallen leaves, dreams deferred, lives hanging in the balance of insurance approvals and payment plans. This was his kingdom, a world where hope came with a price tag, and he held all the patents. The soft murmur of conversations, the gentle beeping of medical equipment in the distance, the antiseptic smell that clung to everything. It all reminded him why he'd built his fortress of wealth. In a world of weakness and vulnerability, money was the only true protection. That's when Marcus saw something that made him stop completely. In the far corner of the cafeteria, near the large windows overlooking the children's garden, sat a young woman he didn't recognize. She couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing scrubs that had seen better days. But it wasn't her appearance that caught his attention. It was what she was doing. The woman sat beside a small boy, perhaps 8 years old, who was clearly struggling with some form of developmental disability. His movements were unsteady, his coordination limited, and he seemed frustrated as he tried to manage his lunch. The woman's patience was extraordinary. She wasn't a nurse. Marcus could tell by the way she moved, the gentle familiarity in her gestures. This was personal. With infinite tenderness, she helped guide the spoon to the boy's mouth, wiping away spills without the slightest hint of irritation. When he managed a successful bite on his own, her face lit up with genuine joy, as if he had just solved the most complex mathematical equation. She spoke to him in soft, encouraging tones, treating him not as a burden or a medical case, but as the most important person in the world. Marcus found himself drawn closer, his usual predatory instincts replaced by something he couldn't quite name. The woman's devotion was absolute, unmarked by the weariness that seemed to permeate everyone else in this place. She fed the child with the same care a master artist might apply paint to canvas, each movement deliberate, loving, perfect. The boy smiled up at her, his eyes bright despite his challenges, and something deep in Marcus's chest, something he'd thought had died years ago, stirred uncomfortably. Marcus stepped closer, pretending to examine the vending machines while keeping the pair in his peripheral vision. The young woman's dedication was mesmerizing in its purity. She wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't seeking recognition or reward. This was simply who she was, someone who loved without condition, who gave without counting the cost. The boy, he learned his name was Tommy when she whispered encouragement, was making slow but determined progress with his meal. Each bite was a small victory, each successful swallow a moment of triumph that the woman celebrated as if witnessing a miracle. Her joy was infectious, and Marcus noticed other families beginning to smile as they watched the tender scene unfold. "That's it, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice carrying just far enough for Marcus to hear. "You're doing so well. I'm so proud of you." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had spoken to him with such unconditional love? When was the last time he had spoken to anyone that way? His own relationships were built on transactions, negotiations, the careful balance of what each party could gain. Love had become a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness that could be exploited. But here, in this sterile hospital cafeteria, he was witnessing something that defied every principle he'd built his life upon. This woman wasn't gaining anything from her kindness. If anything, she was giving everything, her time, her energy, her heart, to someone society often overlooked. There was no profit margin in compassion, no return on investment in unconditional love. Yet she radiated a contentment, a deep satisfaction that all of Marcus's billions had never purchased. She was wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with bank accounts or stock portfolios. Block 4. The Approaching Storm. 300 words. As Marcus watched, absorbed in this unexpected display of human tenderness, his phone buzzed with the familiar urgency that had ruled his life for decades. Without thinking, he answered, his voice automatically shifting to the cold, commanding tone that had built his empire. "Blackwell here." The voice on the other end belonged to his head of legal affairs, and the news was delivered with the clinical precision Marcus demanded from all his employees. A family in Ohio was struggling to pay for their daughter's medication, one of his most profitable drugs. They'd started a crowdfunding campaign that was gaining national attention, complete with heartbreaking photos and a story that was beginning to damage his company's carefully crafted image. "Shut it down," Marcus said without hesitation, his voice carrying across the quiet cafeteria. "Send the cease and desist letters. If they can't afford the medication, they should have considered that before having children with genetic conditions." The words felt automatic, rehearsed from years of similar conversations, but as they left his mouth, Marcus became aware of the sudden silence around him. Other families had stopped eating, their conversations halted by the cold brutality of his statement. The young woman with Tommy had gone completely still, her face pale with shock and something deeper, a profound disappointment that cut through Marcus like a blade. Tommy, sensing the tension, looked up with confused eyes, his small hand reaching for the woman's arm in comfort. The gesture was so innocent, so pure, that it made Marcus's stomach clench with an unfamiliar sensation he refused to identify as shame. The silence stretched on, heavy with judgment and disbelief. Marcus had always prided himself on being immune to others' opinions, but something about this moment felt different. These weren't business rivals or board members he could intimidate. These were parents fighting for their children's lives. Block 5, The Weight of Words, 300 words. Marcus ended the call abruptly, but the damage was done. The young woman, Sarah, he overheard someone call her, sat frozen, her hand protectively covering Tommy's, as if shielding him from the coldness that had suddenly filled the room. Her eyes, when they finally met Marcus's, held no anger, only a deep sadness that was somehow worse than any rage could have been. Other families began gathering their belongings, the comfortable atmosphere shattered by his casual cruelty. A mother with an infant in her arms hurried past, clutching a folder of medical bills. An elderly man supporting his wife, both of them moving with the careful steps of people who'd learned to expect disappointment from those in power. Tommy, oblivious to the undercurrents of adult conflict, tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Hungry," he said simply, his speech slightly slurred but his meaning clear. Sarah's attention immediately returned to the boy, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she resumed helping Tommy eat. She was trying to maintain their bubble of peace, but his words had invaded their sanctuary like poison in a well. Marcus found himself rooted to the spot, watching as Sarah continued to care for Tommy with the same patience and love, despite the emotional blow she'd just received. Her dedication never wavered, her gentleness never diminished. If anything, she seemed to hold Tommy a little closer, love him a little fiercer, as if trying to balance the scales of human kindness that Marcus had just tipped toward darkness. The realization hit him like a freight train. This woman was fighting the same battle as the family in Ohio. She was probably struggling with medical bills, insurance denials, the crushing weight of caring for someone who needed expensive, ongoing treatment. Block 6, a glimpse of truth. 300 words. Unable to resist the pull of curiosity and something deeper he couldn't name, Marcus approached their table. Sarah looked up as his shadow fell across them, her protective instincts immediately activated. She shifted slightly, positioning herself between Marcus and Tommy, her body language screaming caution. "I couldn't help but notice," Marcus began, his voice softer than it had been in years, "your dedication to the boy." Sarah's eyes hardened. "His name is Tommy, and he's my son." The simple statement hit Marcus harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. This wasn't a nurse or caregiver doing her job. This was a mother loving her child with every fiber of her being. A mother who had just heard him dismiss families like hers as if their children's lives were acceptable losses in his pursuit of profit. "I didn't mean to," Marcus started, but Sarah cut him off. "Yes, you did," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You meant every word. I know who you are, Mr. Blackwell. I know what your company charges for the medications that keep children like Tommy alive." Tommy looked between them, sensing tension but not understanding its source. He reached for his mother's hand, his touch immediately calming her, reminding her of what truly mattered. The simple gesture spoke volumes about their relationship, about the unconditional love that flowed between them. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. This woman knew exactly who he was, understood the role he played in making her life infinitely more difficult. Yet she had been sitting here, caring for her son with such beautiful grace. She had every reason to hate him, to rage against the system he represented, but instead, she had simply chosen love. Block 7, the mirror of conscience. 300 words. "How do you do it?" Marcus asked, the question escaping before he could stop himself. His voice carried a vulnerability that surprised them both. Sarah studied his face, searching for mockery or manipulation, but finding only genuine confusion. "Do what?" "Love him so completely when the world—" Marcus gestured helplessly, unable to finish the sentence. "When the world sees him as a burden," Sarah completed, her voice sharp but not cruel. "When the world puts a price tag on his life that we can't afford? When people like you decide that children like Tommy aren't worth saving unless their parents can pay?" Each word was a precision strike, finding every weak point in Marcus's carefully constructed armor. He had built his empire on the foundation that some lives were worth more than others, that supply and demand applied even to human survival. But sitting here, watching Tommy's innocent smile as he successfully managed another bite, that foundation felt increasingly unstable. "I love him because he's my son," Sarah continued, her voice softening as she looked at Tommy. "Because every morning when he wakes up and smiles at me, he makes the world brighter. Because he tries harder than anyone I know just to do things others take for granted. Because he loves everyone he meets with his whole heart, even though the world hasn't always been kind to him." Tommy, hearing his name, looked up at his mother with adoration so pure it made Marcus's throat tight. The boy then surprised everyone by offering Marcus a piece of his cookie, his face open and trusting. The gesture was so unexpected, so generous from someone who had every reason to fear men like Marcus, that it left the billionaire speechless. Sarah watched her son's offer with pride and something that might have been hope. Block 8, the breaking point. 300 words. Marcus stared at the offered cookie, his hands trembling slightly as the full weight of his choices crashed down upon him. This child, this beautiful, innocent boy, whose very existence challenged everything Marcus had built his life upon, was offering to share what little he had. Tommy didn't know about stock prices or profit margins. He didn't understand that the man standing before him was responsible for making his medications so expensive that his mother probably chose between his treatment and paying rent. Tommy only knew kindness. "Take it," Sarah said softly, and Marcus realized she was giving him something far more valuable than a cookie. She was giving him a chance at redemption. With hands that had signed documents condemning thousands to financial ruin, Marcus gently accepted Tommy's gift. The cookie was nothing special, a simple vanilla wafer from the hospital's vending machine, but it tasted like hope, like possibility, like everything he had forgotten about human connection. Tommy clapped his hands together, delighted that his offering had been accepted. His joy was contagious, pure, unmarked by the cynicism that had consumed Marcus's world. In that moment, Marcus saw himself as if from outside his own body, a man who had become so consumed with winning that he had forgotten what he was fighting for. The tears came without warning, rolling down Marcus's cheeks as 30 years of suppressed humanity broke free. He hadn't cried since his wife's funeral, hadn't allowed himself the luxury of feeling anything beyond strategic advantage. But here, faced with this child's uncomplicated love and his mother's fierce protection, all his defenses crumbled. Sarah watched the transformation with cautious wonder, still protecting Tommy, but beginning to see something different in the man before them. Block 9, the confession, 300 words. "I have a grandson," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "Upstairs. He's fighting leukemia with medications that cost more than most people make in a year. Medications my company produces." "Ndudun." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Sarah's expression shifted from wariness to something approaching understanding. She had learned to read the faces of desperate parents, to recognize the particular brand of helplessness that came with watching a child suffer. "The irony isn't lost on me," Marcus continued, sitting down uninvited at their table. Tommy looked at him with curious eyes, unafraid of this stranger who had made his mother sad, but was now crying. "I've spent decades making these drugs unaffordable, telling myself it was just business, supply and demand, market forces." He looked directly at Sarah, his eyes red with tears he hadn't shed in years. "But sitting here, watching you love your son so completely, so unconditionally, I realize I've forgotten what love actually costs. It costs everything, doesn't it? Every defense, every wall, every carefully calculated protection." Sarah nodded slowly, her hand never leaving Tommy's shoulder. "Love doesn't come with a price tag, Mr. Blackwell. It comes with sacrifice, with choosing someone else's happiness over your own comfort, with fighting for them even when the world says they're not worth fighting for." Tommy, sensing the emotional weight of the conversation, reached across the table and patted Marcus's hand with the same gentle touch he'd used to comfort his mother. The gesture was so pure, so instinctively compassionate, that it completed the demolition of Marcus's emotional barriers. "I don't know how to fix what I've done," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be the person who deserves this kindness." Block 10. The path forward, 300 words. Sarah studied Marcus's face for a long moment, weighing years of anger against the possibility of genuine change. Tommy continued to pat the older man's hand, offering comfort in the way children do, without reservation, without judgment, simply because someone was hurting. "You start by doing the right thing," Sarah said finally. "Not because it's profitable, not because it improves your image, but because it's right. You start by remembering that behind every prescription, every insurance denial, every impossible medical bill, there's someone like Tommy. Someone who deserves to live, to grow, to be loved." Marcus nodded, understanding flooding through him like sunrise after the longest night. "The family in Ohio," he said suddenly. "The one my legal team wants to silence. I need to call them back." He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, scrolling to find his lawyer's number. Sarah watched, hope and skepticism warring in her expression. She had seen powerful men make promises before, had watched them disappear as soon as the emotional moment passed. But something about Marcus's transformation felt different. Perhaps it was the way Tommy had immediately trusted him, or maybe it was the genuine anguish in his eyes as he spoke about his grandson. Either way, she found herself believing that this moment might actually matter. Marcus's call was brief, but revolutionary. He instructed his legal team to not only drop their action against the Ohio family, but to provide their daughter's medication free of charge. His voice grew stronger with each decision, as if remembering his own humanity was giving him a different kind of power. When he hung up, Tommy clapped his hands again, somehow understanding that something good had happened. Sarah smiled for the first time since Marcus had arrived at their table, and the expression transformed her entire face. Block 11, the ripple effect. 300 words. Word spread through the hospital with the speed that only good news can achieve. Marcus spent the next hour making call after call, his voice growing steadier and more determined with each conversation. Years of business contacts became conduits for compassion. Insurance denials were overturned. Payment plans became forgiveness programs. The machinery of corporate healthcare that had ground so many families into dust began, slowly, to turn in a different direction. Sarah and Tommy watched in amazement as this man, who had been the symbol of everything wrong with their world, transformed before their eyes into something resembling hope. Other families began to approach, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as news of Marcus's change of heart spread through the pediatric wing. There was Mrs. Henderson, whose grandson needed insulin, Mr. Patel, whose daughter required seizure medication that cost more than his mortgage, the Johnsons, who had been rationing their son's breathing treatments because they couldn't afford the full prescription. One by one, Marcus listened to their stories, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously as he understood the true cost of his former policies. Tommy, still oblivious to the magnitude of what was happening, had adopted Marcus as his newest friend. He shared his coloring book, offered bites of his sandwich, and chatted in his limited but enthusiastic way about his favorite cartoon characters. Every interaction with the child felt like a masterclass in unconditional love, teaching Marcus lessons that decades of board meetings never could. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself laughing, actually laughing at Tommy's silly jokes and earnest observations. The sound was rusty from disuse, but it grew warmer and more natural with each smile the boy earned from him. Sarah watched this unlikely friendship bloom with wonder, seeing her son work the same magic on Marcus that he worked on everyone who took the time to truly see him. Block 12. Everything changes. 300 words. As evening approached, Marcus realized he hadn't thought about stock prices, profit margins, or quarterly reports in hours. Instead, he'd been focused on something infinitely more valuable: the faces of the families he was finally able to help, the relief in parents' eyes when he promised their children would receive the care they needed. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from board members, shareholders, and business partners, alarmed by his sudden policy reversals. Marcus ignored them all. For the first time in decades, there was something more important than business. "I should go check on my grandson," Marcus said finally, but he made no move to leave the table where he had found his humanity again. "What's his name?" Sarah asked gently. "Michael. He's 7. Marcus's voice softened with love he had forgotten he possessed. "He loves dinosaurs and wants to be a paleontologist when he grows up." Tommy's eyes lit up at the word dinosaurs, and he launched into an enthusiastic, if somewhat garbled, description of his favorite prehistoric creatures. Marcus listened with the attention he had once reserved for merger negotiations, asking questions and celebrating Tommy's extensive knowledge with genuine delight. "You should bring Michael down here tomorrow," Sarah suggested. "If he's feeling up to it, Tommy would love to meet another dinosaur expert." The idea of his grandson and Tommy becoming friends, of extending this circle of unconditional love and acceptance, filled Marcus with a joy he didn't know was possible. He nodded, already imagining the boys sharing stories and building friendships that had nothing to do with medical conditions or family wealth. As Marcus finally stood to leave, Tommy hugged his legs with fierce determination. "Friend," he declared, and Marcus knew that everything, his priorities, his purpose, his entire understanding of what made life worth living, had indeed changed forever.